last week when we were analyzing the Beethoven Bagatelle, we ran into a chord that was, well, it looked like a two chord that was major, and it was in first inversion, and it was just before a five chord. And I talked about how we would analyze that as a 5 of 5 chord, and I called it a secondary dominant. I want to look more at those kinds of chords this week. These secondary dominants, or some of you may be familiar with what's called an applied dominant, these show up all over classical music. And they are the third kind of chromaticism that we looked at. So the first kind was, the alterations of chords to create Neapolitans and augmented sixths, things that you can't identify without this very special name. Then there were the borrowed chords, which is basically borrowing chords from the parallel mode. And now these form a final kind of chromaticism, these secondary dominants. Now these secondary dominants, though, are also key to modulation in classical music. We're not going to talk about modulation in this course, but we do, or I feel at least we should, talk about secondary dominants. So let me go through it a little bit. Here we've got a simple 1, 2, 6, 5 to 5 progression in C major. Move that up a bit. Let me play this so you can hear. Good. And we note that the 2 chord is actually the 5th above the 5 chord. And so if we wanted to turn this into not a 2-6-5, from a 2-6-5 into a 5-6-5 of 5, that is to make it a dominant of the dominant, then we just need to change one note. We've got the root, we've got the third, we've got the 5th, and we've got the 7th, and the only thing holding this back from sounding like a dominant 7th chord is the fact that it's minor, because we have the root and the 7th are a minor 7th apart. So the problem is the triad. The triad is minor. If we turn the triad into major, it becomes a dominant chord. So there's our third, and we raise the third to make it major. And now if we go back and listen to it, actually what I'll do instead is this. Oops. And we can compare them right next to each other. We can hear this leading tone resolving up to the tonic. But even when we get here, it still sounds like a 5 chord. It doesn't really, we're not really convinced that it's all of a sudden a new tonic. So in this sense, it's just a coloristic effect, just like the Neapolitan or the augmented sixth or borrowed chords. Now I called these progressions within progressions. And if you go out on the web and you go and Google that, it'll probably just lead you back to this website or to this class. No one really uses this terminology, but I think it's kind of useful nonetheless as a way to describe this. We could look at this and say, look, there's a 1 to 5 progression happening here. And inside that 1 to 5 progression, there's another progression happening, which is also 1 to 5. So this is 5 to 1. This is a 5 to 1 progression, and this is the 1 to 5 progression. So we can see that we have a kind of progression inside of a larger progression. And that's why I call them progressions progressions within progressions. The other thing that these secondary dominants bring up is the idea of function. Now, I said very early on in the class that when we look at the chords of tonal harmony in classical music, we find that there's only one instance of a major triad with a minor 7th. and that's on the dominant 7th chord. So that any time that we get a major triad with a dominant 7th, it functions as a dominant. Now, of course, you can have passing chords where they don't really have a strong function, but in a situation like this chord functions as a dominant. So this is why we can't explain this, for instance, as like, we can't do this. Whoops. You'd say, well, why can't we call it a borrowed chord? Well, first of all, who is it borrowing from? Because in C minor, this chord isn't major. Well, why can't we just explain it as a major 2, 6, 5, going to 5? What's wrong with that? Because it doesn't explain the relationship between these chords. The relationship between these chords is a dominant to tonic relationship. And so we need the Roman numeral analysis to explain that dominant to tonic relationship. And that's why we have this, at times, frustrating to students notation of the 5 of 5. But this issue of function is really important because, and I want to look at it with borrowed chords, because just because something's a major triad, for instance, doesn't mean that it's a dominant chord. When we make an alteration, it doesn't mean that we need to explain things as all of a sudden as a 5 of something. We have to look at how it functions. Let's move on to G minor. We'll move on to this example. G minor, 1 chord, the 4-6-4, the pedal 6-4, going back to 1. Let me play this. Okay. Borrowed chord. If we analyze this, what's right after it? Let me play this with the borrowed chord. So this, rather than being minor, which it's supposed to be in a minor key, this 4 chord is now major. We've borrowed from the parallel minor, from the parallel major. It's beautiful sound, actually. Well, okay, now I'm going to do something. Watch this. If we look at this last progression, we see that we've got the 1 chord. And you say, so this is a 4-6-4. And then we go here and we get, well, if I have to explain that, that's like a major, the 7 major chord. So usually we get the diminished chord, but here we get the 7 major chord. If I play this though, if you listen to it, you'll see that this actually doesn't explain what's happening here sonically. Actually, we hear, we have dominant going to tonic. We can hear this dominant going to tonic. Let me play it one more time so that you can hear it. And because of that, we can explain it this way. We actually need to explain this as a 5-6-4 of the 7 major chord going to 7 major. So I wanted to use this example to illustrate how we really have to listen to harmony in order to do analysis, and that we always need to put harmony in context. And that when we hear dominant tonic relationships, we have to explain them as dominant tonic relationships. Now, as we've seen here, we've got a 5 of 5 and we have a 5 of 7 major. Are there other 5s of whatevers? The answer is yes. And what I want to do in the next video is show you some of the more common ones so that they add to your repertoire of harmonic progressions. And then at that point, you actually have an extremely rich toolbox of harmonic progressions that you can use to craft your music.